Hey guys, this is Russ. This is an excellent show we did with Marty, but I just wanted to, I completely forgot to ask him to explain to us what his background is. So this prologue basically is for me to explain his background. He sent it to me. So
Rookie move.
yeah, it was a rookie move. I know.
Hate to see it happen.
Yeah. We were just already in the conversation. We just rolled in here and started talking. So
Yeah, that's right.
and we were just like, everybody knows who this guy is. Come
Had
on.
a couple G&Ts and
That's
boom.
Yeah, that's right.
Show on.
Yeah, so Marty is a 35-year veteran of the monster truck industry. He's the owner, designer, and builder of the legendary Overkill monster truck, winner of multiple national and world championships, author of the book Monster Truck Technology, The Definitive History of Monster Truck Evolution. He's also the vice president of the Monster Truck Racing Association and inductee into the International Monster Truck Hall of Fame. And in terms of UFOs, he's had a lifelong interest in the subject. He's actively studied the UFO phenomenon for over 30 years. He was a former investigator from MUFON and a former administrator of the UFO Conspiracy Forum for Fox's Encounters TV series. So that's Marty Garza, and that's who we interview. Well, we just talked to him the whole episode. So
Yep.
that's it. All right, guys, here we go.
UFOs in the Modern Era with Marty Garza on Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents, to Brothers of the Serpent podcast, coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed, high atop the Edwards Plateau. We're having another special in-studio guest recording on the weekend. It's Sunday, and we got plenty of drinks and smokes.
That's right.
And we have Marty in here with us. What's up, buddy?
Doing all right. Snake Force is in the house.
That's right.
Yeah,
In the tangent cube.
Welcome to the cube.
Welcome to the cube, buddy. Yeah, so he showed up earlier in the afternoon, and we've been kind of hanging out, talking ancient stuff as usual, talking Snake Bros stuff. And we wanted to record an episode because you so Kyle and I are interested in the phenomenon of UFOs and whatever they are. You know, I'm like on this. I love Valet's take on it. That's really, he changed my whole world, right? And so I don't know if it's spiritual or consciousness based or whatever's happening, but you have been involved in researching it and just watching what people say about it for way longer than we have. So we kind of wanted to get you in here to talk about it because we've been wanting to, because of the recent stuff happening, right, with the Pentagon stuff and the videos coming out and this whole To the Stars and everything, that this is kind of in the news right now. And we were like, we need to do a UFO show. We've never done a show that's totally about that subject. And since you came into the Discord and we started hanging out, I'm like, okay, this guy knows his stuff. He actually lives right close by. So I was like, come down here and tell us what you know. So go.
Well, first of all, you referred to me as a researcher, and I want to set the record straight. I don't consider myself a researcher on the subject.
Right.
I am an observer of the phenomenon
Yeah.
and the investigations surrounding it. So I kind of have...
You're an armchair
tried-
researcher, right?
Well, I'm an observer of the armchair researchers
Okay, all right.
well
All right.
as well as the phenomenon itself. Trying to assemble all of the different observations made by all these different researchers and trying to organize them in somewhat of a cohesive picture.
Yeah.
Which is very difficult to do because, as you know, this is a phenomenon that touches on so many different facets of the technological side and the spiritual side and the consciousness side, and it's something that is very difficult to wrap our heads around because we have a tendency to gravitate towards certain aspects of the phenomenon that maybe we're more familiar with or more comfortable with, and we tend to focus on that aspect and ignore all the other. And I don't think you can get a good feel for what's going on just segregating it like that. You have to have this all-encompassing view of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a like you have to come into it with as little bias as possible, right? You can't have any kind of preconceived ideas of what it might be because it's so strange and so wide ranging. But that's what I mean. That's what happens to everybody, right? When I first started looking at this, I'm like, it's aliens coming from space, and I don't know if that's probably not been what everybody has thought. And that's definitely not what's been everybody's thought about it since the beginning of time, because this stuff has been happening for a long time, I think. But that's definitely how I first came into it. I'm like, these are aliens flying ships around in our sky. But the more you dive into it, the more you start to realize, well, that doesn't really fit the whole phenomena. And that's when it becomes a lot more, less black and white, more nebulous.
Yeah, I think that it is interpreted based on the mindset of the period. I believe the phenomenon has existed throughout human history.
Yeah.
And it has just been described in different ways. We have to recognize that a lot of the terminology that we use didn't exist in ancient times. So they would have been describing what they were seeing based on things they were familiar with.
Right.
And I think that same is true even in the 1800s, even in the early 1900s. There are rather consistent reports of phenomena that match exactly what the reports we see today. They're just using terminology that is more relevant to the technologies or the sensitivities of the individuals at that period.
Right. So like the airship sightings, or if you go back even farther, where people were actually seeing what they talked about as being boats, like ships as in ocean-going ships in the sky. Like there's even one
Chariots in the sky?
Yeah, well, there's even one I remember reading where, I mean, it seemed the report is, and this might be in the Magonia book, the Passport to Magonia, where it drops an anchor, and then the anchor gets stuck somewhere near the church, and then like some guy comes out of the ship, climbs down the chain like he's swimming down to figure out what the anchor is stuck on. There's these weird reports throughout time, and you're like, wait a minute, it looked to them like a sailing ship in the sky.
Imagine trying to describe an event using terms you're familiar with for something that you're struggling to understand. It's there. In other words, you can't say, well, it was a rocket shape or a saucer shape, or if those things didn't exist, you can't. The airship sightings, they were describing what we would, I guess, today consider cigar-shaped objects.
Yeah.
And dirigibles had existed since the early 1800s, so it's understandable that would be the most easily referenced shape you would see in the sky.
Right.
Now, Zeppelins didn't exist yet. They didn't exist for about another
So what's the difference?
7 years. In other words, a rigid airship versus a balloon, effectively. So, but interestingly enough, those sightings of the airships, there was a lot of consistency, and one of the consistencies was spotlights.
Right.
They would consistently report spotlights searching the ground. Very often, they were reported as having crews that were humans.
Yeah.
Although I have a really interesting report that I dug up that throws you for a loop because it is so similar to what is being described now, and it's not generally what we would consider the typical airship or mystery airship type sighting. So
you're saying that it actually follows along with things that we see today, as opposed to being a cigar shape.
Well, I'll read this to you. This is a little synopsis of the sighting.
Okay.
And see how many things you can pick out of this.
All right.
That sound like what we're hearing today.
Okay.
This incident occurred on April 19th, 1897. A gentleman named Alexander Hamilton in Yates Center, Kansas, outside of Kansas City, was awakened by a noise made by his cattle. When he went outside to see what was causing the disturbance, he observed a 300-foot-long cigar-shaped airship, quote, in quotes, with 3 lights descending over his corral. He rushed back in his house and awakened his son and his ranch hand, and the 3 ran out with axes. They came within 50 yards of the craft, and as they approached, they noticed an undercarriage made of, quote, made of panels of glass, which were brilliantly lit from inside. Visible inside were 2 men, a woman, and 3 children described as the strangest beings he had ever seen. A huge beam of light was shown at them, and then a great, quote, great turbine wheel about 30 feet in diameter slowly began revolving below the craft, and it began to buzz, sounding precisely like the cylinder of a separator, and the vessel rose as lightly as a bird, unquote. At an altitude of about 300 feet, it stopped and hovered over a 2-year-old heifer that was trapped in a fence. The men tried frantically to release the animal, but the heifer slowly began to rise as the craft ascended, and they both disappeared into the sky.
Whoa.
The next morning, Hamilton went out searching for the animal on horseback. After searching all day, as he returned home, the neighboring ranch owner, Link Thomas, informed him that he had found the hide, head, and legs of a heifer with Hamilton's brand in his field that had appeared to have been drawn and quartered. Hamilton was considered a man of unquestionable veracity and was a former House Senate representative who was widely known in the area. After the incident, 12 prominent residents signed an affidavit attesting to Hamilton's honesty.
Yeah.
Wow.
Man, that's that's a classic story too. Like it picks up the cow. That's really
All right, so you have a cigar-shaped object or airship shining beams with an undercarriage made of glass. That's a...
Immediately I thought of the Book of Enoch.
Oh, yeah.
He goes into a room that's made of glass where it's illuminated behind the glass.
Yeah,
that takes him up, and he sees all the gates and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Then he talks about this 30-foot diameter spinning wheel, which immediately reminded me of Ezekiel.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the cattle.
The cattle mutilations thing, yeah. But also the 3 lights, like I was saying, a lot of people see, these 3 lights in the sky. That's where you get the idea of these triangular 3 lights moving together.
What was the year on this? What was it
April
again?
19th, 1897.
1897, yeah. Wow. And they find the cow drawn and quartered, is that what they said?
Yes.
Do you think that's just their offhanded description of what was probably more like a mutilation?
Well, he says that they found the head and hindquarters separate. So apparently the majority of the cow was missing.
Oh, wow.
But that's the earliest reference to any sort of cattle mutilation or that I've found.
Okay, yeah.
But
I know the earliest one I don't know the date of it, but I know the first mutilation that kind of made big news and sort of kicked off in the same way that Kenneth's sighting sort of kicked off the new UFO phenomena and the flying saucers and stuff was actually a horse, right?
Smiley.
That's right. It was Smiley, yeah. Belonged to a girl, and they found the horse in the same sort of with parts of the jaw, the anus cord out, whatever, eyeballs gone. They found the horse in that condition, and that was what started the cattle mutilation flap that's more modern.
According to Gordon Lohr Jr., assistant director of NICAP, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, between 1896 and 1897, there were over 1,000 sightings across the U.S., and following their investigations, at least 200 of them were considered unsolvable.
Wow. So, but and he says that there were the beings in there. They had children, and they were the strangest,
quote, the strangest
beings he's
he had
ever seen. Man. I wish it was a better description than that.
You know, but there are many instances of witnesses describing seeing, for example, Betty and Barney Hill.
Yeah.
They saw what they thought were people
Right.
looking out the windows at them.
That's right.
The Father Gus sighting, he observed, not only did he observe what he thought were people in the craft, he waved to them and they waved back.
Okay, so that implies an understanding of the semaphore, right? Like, yeah, a truly alien being wouldn't know what that motion was. You know, you wave your hand, they're like, "Oh my God, he's trying to kill us."
Unless they've been visiting us for thousands of years.
For thousands of years, yeah. Yeah. What do you think? You think they're people?
That's a really difficult question. There's ample evidence in terms of anecdotal evidence, I guess you could say, that would suggest that we're dealing with more than one thing.
Yes, totally agree with that.
There is definitely a technological nuts and bolts component to this, but at the same time, there are plenty of instances of things that are just patently absurd,
Right.
that do not fit within the, our general sense of what a quote alien would, unquote, would be doing.
Right.
These appear to be either some form of consciousness, some form of interdimensional type being. There's something else. Then again, there is also the distinct possibility that these strange or anomalous type sightings or incidents are more along the lines of a projection to deceive or to somehow impress the witness in a way that
Hides what's really happening.
it's deep, right? It's a
deceptive.
form of deception.
Yeah.
Or it could be someone's inability to rationalize what they're seeing. They're trying. Their brain is desperately trying to grasp at something they can hang on to be able to make sense out of what they're seeing.
Yeah.
So Enoch describes meeting, what he calls angels, these beings that are obviously they're like humans in a way. And they take him and they're talking to him and they're doing all this stuff. They take him eventually to the Most High. And that being is light, and it's so overwhelming he can't look directly at it. And that's like, in his interpretation, that he was talking to God. God's telling him stuff to do or whatever, but he's just like, he was completely made of light, and he just can't even,
Can't
I'm
look
averting my
directly
eyes, oh Lord.
Yeah.
So it's weird.
What are you doing now?
Yeah. So it's, from the description of this crystalline room that he goes inside of, it's sort of like this high technology, these angelic beings, all the way to some being that's just pure light that he can't even comprehend and can't even look at it.
There have been many people that have gone through, religious scripture and tried to pick out things or pointed out things that could have been in misinterpretation. A lot of times people would see, angels or demons or, there's all sorts of different, throughout the ages, there have been different types of things that have said to come into bedrooms and, impregnate women. And again, those may have been just their version of what we today consider an alien abduction or some type of an alien encounter. Again, it could be all perceptual differences.
Yeah. Well, I just wonder about the, if it is a pure deception, what's the reason for the cow? Like what they're actually doing something to the animal there.
Well,
and that does continue.
One thing we got to be very cautious with is not to try to use what we would consider logic and apply it to
Yeah, you're right.
something else, because
Yeah.
we may be incapable of understanding what's going on. It could be something that's completely beyond our ability to recognize.
Yeah, that's true. And I have also read reports in when I was looking at the mutilation stuff. This isn't hard. This isn't, you don't see this very many places, but people who have really done dives into the mutilation thing, there are plenty of other animals that have been found in that with the same kind of mutilation that are domestic, right? Like, I don't know. I do think that I remember seeing something about some people have found rabbits that are like that, you know, with the same sort of surgical precision of parts removed. But it's cats and dogs that are found this way too. So it's like these animals that we have domesticated, like a cow. You know, now a cow is a source of food also, so people think that may have something to do with it. But these animals that are surrounding us, because we have sort of brought them into our world and by hybridization and breeding have changed them into something that they weren't in the natural realm, are the ones that get mutilated the most often. Unless it's happening in the woods all the time and we just don't know it. I mean, that's totally possible that deer and stuff in the woods are also, you know, this is also happening. It's just when people notice when it happens to their pet or to their cattle, right? So,
Well, you know, and we have the ability to recount experiences where the animals can't.
right, yeah.
You know,
That's right. That's what I'm saying. So we notice when it happens to our pets, like a cat or a dog, or to our horses or to our cattle, but would people notice if it was happening to deer in the forest? I don't know.
You know, the abduction, you know, phenomenon, that's a really sensitive area also that a lot of researchers stay clear of, because it's really hard to accept.
Yeah.
But you look at the statistics, you know, there have been several polls taken, Gallup polls and a few others, and they range. There's a pretty broad range in the percentage, but even if you take on the low end, the lowest poll I've seen said that 0.3% of the population believes that they've been abducted by some form of entity.
Yeah.
On the high side, I've seen as much as 2% of the population. So you're talking about somewhere between
2% of the population in the United States? Is that what you're talking about?
yeah.
Okay.
So so we're talking something like 600,000, between 600,000 and 4.5 million people
Wow.
have this same delusion. So even if that is the case and it's some form of delusion, why is there consistency in the delusion?
Yeah.
That alone is worth investigating.
Yes. Yeah, and when we were talking about this earlier, I was thinking of, maybe the watcher can figure this out. There's a type of thing that happens to people where they suddenly become convinced that that their loved ones are imposters. Watcher, you know what I'm talking about? There's a name for it. And it's similar across all these cases, and it's a psychological thing where all of a sudden somebody just becomes convinced that everybody that is in their family or whatever, they've been replaced by exact lookalikes who aren't really the people that they love. You know, now that's a really strange thing to happen to somebody, but it's always the same across all these cases. Now, I'm not trying to argue that we have that these 4.5 million, between 600,000 to 4.5 million people who think they might have been abducted have some kind of mental problem. I'm just saying that it is possible to have very similar, very specific, whatever you would call them. I don't know if it's delusion is the right word. And of course,
Capgras syndrome.
yes, Capgras.
Capgras.
Yeah, imposter syndrome or Capgras delusion. So what he's saying now, standard model scriptards have said, well, you're just deluded. Well, how do we know? Maybe those people really have been replaced. I mean, what's who knows what's really happening? But it comes on suddenly, and it's a very strange thing. Maybe it's an effect of something else.
I guess I look at it like this. If one day your neighbor came and told you that they saw a suspicious individual in your backyard, you'd probably be concerned.
Yeah.
Now, if, let's say, you saw someone suspicious in your neighbor's backyard,
Uh-huh.
your neighbor would probably be concerned.
Yeah.
if the police reported seeing suspicious people in your neighborhood,
Yeah.
you would be concerned.
Yeah.
If the military,
Yeah.
told,
Yeah.
put out a statement saying that they had seen suspicious people over or in secure military installations, you
Yeah.
would be concerned. So if all these things would be cause for concern, how can they then turn around and say there's
no
nothing
cause
to worry
for concern?
about?
Yeah.
Right. Because it's indisputable that people are reporting these things.
Right.
That's not in question here. What's in question is what is it?
Right.
They're saying they're prosaic explanations, and we're saying, well, maybe when there's consistency again, and we'll touch upon this and maybe in the next segment, but one of the tactics that is very often used to discredit sightings is they take individual sightings as standalone cases.
Yep.
They
That's
will
right.
not, very rarely will they, and I've got some really good examples of it, but very rarely will they take two different individual reports that are describing the same object where they can triangulate and make estimations for size and altitude and all.
Yeah.
Generally, they're taken as individuals, and you'll very often find in like Blue Book reports and all that they will have one explanation for one and a completely different explanation for the other, even though they happened simultaneously. They were describing the same object in the same area. So that's where this overview is important, but not only for a specific sighting, but for a pattern of sightings over decades or maybe centuries.
Yeah.
When you're seeing this consistency of what these people are describing having seen.
Yeah.
So we read that Russ read that article you sent us, and we're looking at that, how long this has been going on. The things that they were saying way back. I can't remember what the year was.
You talk about the Life magazine thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where they're saying, report these and you won't be ridiculed and blah, 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 blah.
It's like,
And of course, the story we've seen that you can see that unfolded after that with sightings and how people were ridiculed and everything. And then what's going on now where the government is basically saying, yes, we have been looking at this and that's all coming out. The question in my mind is this all... Like, it's just strange to me how the government is sort of wrapped up in this investigation, and it makes the whole thing seem like a psyop. Are they, what is the motive for what's happening right now? What do you think?
I think to best answer that question, it's important to recognize the history of this, going back to the beginning of the modern era of UFO sightings, and observe the pattern of behavior on the part of the Air Force and the U.S. government, as well as other governments. There are several key indicators of the things that were being done behind the scenes that give us a feeling for what it was that they really intended to do with. I'll explain. First of all, very often you will hear references to. In fact, Linda Zimmerman made reference to the War of the Worlds.
yeah.
And talking about how not only the mass hysteria aspect, but the fact that it may have caused the beginning of people reporting things in the skies, right? Well, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers comics were out several years before that.
Yeah.
And they were already covering, rockets and things like that. That didn't exist yet, of course.
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't until 1947, 10 years after the War of the Worlds, or 9 years after the War of the Worlds, that the first, highly publicized UFO sighting, Kenneth Arnold sighting, occurred.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, there were widespread reports, but there were things that were going on that caused that. I mean, it wasn't the public that was necessarily driving all of the sightings. For example, I personally believe that one of the if you want to be convinced that there is a legitimate basis for the existence of the phenomenon, and that it may be something more than just some prosaic events that are not properly recognized. Edward Ruppelt's book. Edward Ruppelt was the head of Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. And he was hand-tied, I'm sure, in what he could and could not say.
Yeah.
But if you read between the lines, and not even that, if you read what he says, he is pretty definitive about the things that he saw. And he brings up several very important points. One of them that struck me, I think most people are probably familiar with the Kenneth Arnold sighting.
Yeah.
And that was June 24th, 1947.
Yeah, and the War of the Worlds you're talking about is the broadcast, the radio broadcast of the story that caused some hysteria in some people.
Trial balloon.
Well,
Yeah.
keep in mind, here's another, this context thing of keeping things in context. Understand that War of the Worlds was a radio broadcast that was a 1-hour broadcast.
Yeah.
This was in the age before cassette tapes or VCRs
no
or
recording, yeah.
YouTube. In other words, only the people that were listening at that time heard the broadcast.
Yeah.
And 70% of the people polled. Roper polls began in 1935. So they started 2 years before, 4 years before the War of the Worlds. So they actually conducted a poll. 70% of the people that heard the show knew it was a radio show.
Yeah.
It was not really happening.
Everybody who tuned in a little too late
Right.
just started hearing it as a news broadcast because that's how it's sort of presented. But if you tuned in too late to hear the intro to where you understood it was a story, you think it's a real news broadcast.
Right. But
Must have been awesome.
but even then, there have been some studies about that. I'm trying to pull up my.
But don't they use that as an excuse? I've seen this as an excuse, like, oh, if people thought this was real, or if the government admitted that it was real, then there would be this mass hysteria that people would flip out. There would be religious crazies, and I've seen all kinds of explanations like that. This is why the government won't say it's real.
Right. For 70 plus years, we've heard that the mass panic aspect is the reason for the secrecy.
Right.
Okay. Well, media historian Joseph Campbell did a study, and he states that the panic and mass hysteria so readily associated with War of the Worlds did not occur on anything approaching a nationwide dimension. He quotes Robert E. Bartholomew, an authority on mass panic outbreaks, as having said, there is a, quote, there is a great consensus among sociologists that the extent of the panic was greatly exaggerated, unquote. So that begs the question, when did the exaggeration begin?
Yeah.
And for what purpose?
Right.
That's what I'm saying. It's trial balloon.
Yeah.
Like the whole War of the Worlds thing was like, okay, let's
see what happens.
We'll say this is a story, but we know people will not get the
everyone will,
beginning,
yeah.
and we'll see how bad the mass hysteria is. And it wasn't as bad as they thought it was, so then they went ahead and just
Claimed that it was
really bad, even though, okay, so assuming that they actually are researching this and have come to the conclusion that we are being visited by beings from other worlds.
Yeah.
Run the trial balloon, and then basically use it. Okay, so it could be multifaceted. It could have been used to create hysteria that they could then say it's hysteria.
Yeah.
And so when it didn't create enough hysteria, they hyped how much hysteria it did. You're saying
Yeah, it did kind of. Yeah, they blew it up.
They blew it up,
Yeah.
so that then that sort of creates this thing that's like, oh yeah, people are just seeing things because of that radio show.
They created hysteria about the hysteria that didn't actually exist.
That's right.
Well, what was actually going on at the Air Force might have been a little bit different than what we might be perceived from the outside, according to Ruppelt. Following Kenneth Arnold's sighting, he claimed that the objects were 45 to 50 feet in diameter, traveling at an estimated speed of 1,700 miles an hour. Immediately, the ATIC, which is the Air Tactical Intelligence Center, tried to downplay the sighting and say, no, you were seeing military jets. They were much closer. They were only going 400 miles an hour. But that theory was shot down because Arnold, for one, if the aircraft were that close, he would have very easily identified them.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, he was very specific that they passed behind the mountains and not in front. So based on the distance, the objects, not only was the speed accurate, but if anything, his estimations in size were probably off. The objects may have been slightly larger than he was expecting.
Yeah.
Than what he claimed. Then, just a couple of days after, on June 28th, the Air Force had a report of a F-51 fighter over Lake Mead in Nevada. The pilot witnessed 5 to 6 UFOs flying off his right wing in broad daylight at 3:15 in the afternoon. So the reports started piling up very quickly. Maxwell Air Force Base on June 28th had a sighting of a this was a light, which, that's a little more questionable, but it was a zigzagging light with bursts of speed making 90-degree turns.
Whoa.
Seen it.
Yep.
Totally have seen that.
Here's something, just a little paragraph, just a little sentence in that book that, and I've read the book 2 or 3 times, and I didn't even pick up on this until just recently.
Yeah, he brought his books. They're pretty worn.
I have the original version because some things were changed later, which that might be
hey,
a cause for pause. But Ruppelt states this. This is pretty interesting. He says that he was told when he was. Remember, let me
give some context.
That at the beginning, shortly after Arnold's sighting, ATIC actually asked for there to be a project to investigate UFOs within the Air Force, a secret project. It was called Project Sign. Project Sign got started, and Ruppelt joined later. But he was told, he says this in the book, he says he was told that the incident which took place on July 8th, 1947 at Muroc Air Force Base was what kicked the Air Force's interest in the phenomenon into high gear. Very specific of the date, July 8th, 1947. Coincidentally, that's the exact date that Walter Haut issued the press release stating that RAFF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region.
Oh, hey. Wow.
Very interesting that Ruppelt pointed out that date.
Yeah. All right, everybody think about that while we take a break. I'm going to be thinking about that. We'll be right back with more Marty!
Snacks! And we are back, Brothers of the Serpent podcast, here with the UFO researcher extraordinaire, thrice removed, Marty, taking us down the UFO rabbit hole, and
talking history.
Yeah, that's
history
true.
of the modern era right now.
Yeah. So yeah, during the break, I was wanting you to tell me again the connection there with the
date and the
yeah.
I found it really interesting that Ruppelt went out of his way to specifically name that date, July 8th, 1947. And it maybe legitimately there may have been another event that caused concern to the Air Force, but
at some Air Force base, and it's secret still.
Right.
Yeah, because they weren't specific about location or anything, but it kind of
he does mention the base,
that it's at a different base.
But he follows up with something that I thought was fairly interesting and may have some connection to that. And he says that by that time, Attic had already concluded, quote, the reported phenomenon was real, unquote, and urged the creators of the task force to investigate. By September 23rd, 1947, Project Sign had established a study of the phenomenon. In his book, he states that Project Sign said they would have answers within less than a year, unquote. And he says, for what UFOs are, and emphasized that the question, do UFOs exist, was never raised.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps that naive estimation for the amount of time it would take to get to the bottom of it was based on the fact that they may have had wreckage in their possession.
Yeah.
And maybe they did get to the bottom of some of it.
And like you said, it's probably more than one thing. So getting to the bottom of one particular incident or even a flap doesn't necessarily mean you've gotten to the bottom of the whole phenomena.
Well, I think things started to change a little bit shortly after that. On January 7th, another pivotal case happened. January 7th, 1948, the Louisville Courier newspaper carried the headline, F-51 and Captain Mantell destroyed chasing flying saucer. As many of you know, this was investigated by Project Sign. They claimed that he chased this balloon up to 20,000 feet.
Oh, that's the one over the lake?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't over a lake. He crashed on land. But
all right.
They claimed that he was chasing a balloon and that he ascended to 20,000 feet until he passed out from lack of oxygen and crashed. But he stated that, quote, the object looks metallic and is of tremendous size. Regarding the incident, Ruppelt wrote, to the press, the nonchalant, offhanded manner at which Sign had written off the sighting showed great confidence in their conclusion. Venus. I'm sorry, they thought it was the planet Venus.
What?
Sign carried it as being the planet Venus.
Yeah, it's very large and metallic.
That's right.
But he says, behind the barbed wire fence that encircled Attic, the nonchalant attitude did not exist among the intelligence analysts. Interestingly, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who also later became a very famous UFO researcher, he was working for Project Blue Book, and he was really one of the early skeptics.
Yeah, he's this famous swamp gas guy.
Right, and let's see here.
So which one was it that was over the lake? Because there was a similar... Was it over a lake? The plane chased it up, way up high, and it was right at the Canadian border. And then they tried to say that it was a plane from Canada that was impinging on U.S. airspace. But
I don't remember that.
Okay,
that specific
but
case.
he chased it. They've never. I don't think they've ever. Well, maybe they did find the plane. I'm trying to remember if it crashed into the water and they lost it. But he did. It was the same thing. He chased it up and up and up and up and up, and then they assumed that he lost consciousness.
Well, J. Allen Hynek was the head of astronomy at Ohio State University, and he's the one that came up with the determination that it was the planet Venus. But in his book, Ruppelt states, he said that the, quote, weasel-worded report carried that said that it was planet Venus was later, J. Allen Hynek admitted to him that even on a clear day, that Venus would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to see. And it was not a clear day when it occurred.
Right. Yeah, that's the other thing about it being Venus is it was during the day at like 3 p.m, right?
That's got to be insulting. I mean, you're a pilot and you're accused of chasing another planet.
Yeah, a planet. Yeah.
He says that Attic's investigation searched for skyhook balloons, sundogs, and even reflection on his canopy. However, Ruppelt states, everybody at Attic was convinced that the object Mantell was after was a spaceship and that this was the only course that would be pursued. So what they were saying publicly was completely different than what they were saying internally.
Yeah. Why would they do that? I guess it was still a secret at the time. And ATIC, I know you told us, but what does it stand for again? ATIC? It's the aviation, what is it?
Let me see here.
That's fine.
Look at
Air Tactical Intelligence Center.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So,
Yeah, the Watcher's given us specifications of the Mustang, IP-51 Mustang specifications. Max ceiling is 41,900 feet. So he must have chased it pretty high.
yeah, I think they claim he chased it to 20,000 feet when the plane crashed or came back down. By July of 1948, Sign had conducted an investigation of the reported maneuvers of the unknown objects, and came back with what they called the estimate of the situation, and it concluded that the objects were, quote, intelligently controlled, unquote, and likely, quote, interplanetary in origin, unquote.
Yeah.
That report was forwarded to the Pentagon, and General Hoyt Vandenberg rejected the conclusion. Representatives from ATIC were sent to the Pentagon to make their case, and Vandenberg could not be convinced. So the report was destroyed, although Ruppelt states that there were a few copies that were maintained.
That's the other weird thing, is I know that they would destroy a lot of their data. You know, there would be these purges.
You know, and the other thing, I guess, that's important to consider is that this was not going on just here in the United States. There were, in Europe at that same time, they were having what they called ghost rocket sightings.
Yes, the ghost rockets.
And then the fireball sightings.
Yeah.
The fireball sightings were started happening here in the United States as well. They were seeing these bright green fireballs.
Yeah.
There was another project headed by Dr. Lincoln La Paz that was called Project Twinkle. And they conducted investigations of sightings. There were quite a few of them in New Mexico. They were seen all over the United States. He concluded that they were not meteoric in origin because their trajectory was too flat, they were too green, and despite extensive attempts, no fragments could be found. I will say this. In recent years, there have been discussions about aircraft that used what they call zip fuel, and this is a boron-based fuel. In fact, the SR-71 and A-12 spy planes, the Blackbird, used a small amount of, from my understanding, used a small amount of this boron fuel to ignite the engines. And this boron burns green.
So that's why when the engines come on, it's green and then it turns blue.
Yeah. And
That's cool.
And in recent years, there have been persistent reports of something that's been flying over the skies here in the United States that they refer to as the Green Lady. That's supposed to be some form of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. And it allegedly uses some type of boron fuel.
Wow.
So it's conceivable that those fireball sightings may not have had anything to do with the other sightings that were going on, and that they may have been tests of, maybe they were just doing tests of the boron fuel.
Yeah. The ghost rockets, too, are strange. I think Micah Hanks wrote a book about the ghost rocket sightings. And he points out that even though they sound like, when you look at them briefly, that you think, all right, they're rockets flying over. But once you dig down into the reports, they have the same weird high strangeness as a lot of these UFO things. Even though they act like rockets, they're basically cigar shaped with flames at the back. But some of them like land in water and then come back out and down into people's lake. Okay, so the Watcher says the incident I was talking about is the Kinross incident over Lake Superior. That's the one I was thinking of, where he basically does the same thing. He gets in a plane, he chases something to some ridiculously high altitude, and then he falls back into the lake. And they claim it was a Canadian aircraft that flew accidentally across the border. But of course, the Canadians are like, no, we didn't do that. It was a UFO incident, though.
Well, shortly after the Mantell incident, Project Sign was changed to Project Grudge.
Yeah.
And Ruppelt discusses that a little bit in his book, and he says this drastic change in attitude was as difficult to explain many people within sign to the many people within sign. Although intelligence circles people had chosen sides, the two UFO factions that exist today were born. So he's suggesting that there were factions within the Air Force that were convinced that these things were of concern and were possibly interplanetary aircraft.
Yeah.
Or craft, and another faction that either didn't buy it or didn't want it investigated.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's not Nick Pope. Nick Redfern. Are you familiar with that guy in any of his research? Nick Redfern. He's done a lot. Well, he's done a lot of UFO stuff, and he talked about there was a group of people in the government that was also seemed to be concerned that these things were demonic, basically.
Yeah, I've heard references to that.
Yeah.
In fact, Ruppelt does expand on this. He says this change in operating policy was so pronounced that, like so many other people, I wondered if there was a hidden reason for the change. Was it an effort to cover up the fact that the UFOs had been proven to be interplanetary, and that it should be withheld from the public at all costs to prevent mass panic?
Yeah.
So even Ruppelt was unsure of what was going on.
Yeah.
I just can't buy that, the mass panic thing. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a government official deciding what the public should know or not, so I can't really speak from authority on this, but it just seems like such a petty reason for secrecy. Like mass panic.
Yeah.
Like, well, how long would the mass panic last? I mean, it's not going to be like, even if it actually does take place, what are you going to do? I mean, what are they afraid that is going to happen?
So up until that point, up until January of 1949, the Air Force had been fairly open about discussing the topic. Then all of a sudden, something changed, and Ruppelt says, to one who is ultimately familiar with UFO history, it is clear that Project Grunge had a two-phase program of UFO annihilation. The first phase consisted of explaining every UFO report, and the second phase was to tell the public how the Air Force had solved all of the sightings.
Yeah.
This Project Grunge reasoned would put an end to the UFO reports. However, he says that the reason that the project name was changed was because that the Project Sign's name had been compromised. And he said, this was all, and this is a quote from Ruppelt, this was always my official answer to any question about the name change. I'd go further and say that the name change from Sign to Grudge had no significance. This wasn't true. They did have significance, a lot of it. He went on to refer to Project Grudge as the dark age of intellectual stagnation on the subject of UFOs.
Yeah. It's weird to me that they called it Grudge. Grudge against what?
Well, here's something that's really interesting about this phase. Soon after Grunge was started, or the name was changed to Grunge, they approached Sidney Shallett, a writer for the Saturday Evening Post, claiming that he had the, quote, prerequisites that were desired. And the Air Force Public Relations Officer, Harry Habner, was assigned to coach Shallett on exactly what to say. He wrote a two-part article that appeared in the April 30th and May 7th issues of the Saturday Evening Post. And about those articles, Ruppelt states, it's important in UFO history to understand that because this had considerable effect on public opinion. Shallett's article casually admitted that a few UFO sightings couldn't be explained, but the reader didn't have much of a chance to think about that fact because 99% of the article was devoted to the anti-saucer side of of the problem.
Yeah.
The article started out by psychologically conditioning the reader by using phrases like the great flying saucer scare, rich full-blown screwiness, and fearful freaks, and so forth. So by the time the reader gets to the meat of the article, he feels like a rich full-blown jerk for even be thinking about UFOs.
Yeah.
So clearly there was now a strategy of discrediting witnesses and diminishing the importance of sightings, the validity of sightings.
Yeah, and making people feel like if they had thought they had seen something that they might be crazy, or making people who hadn't seen anything think that anybody who claimed to have seen something was either crazy or looking for attention, all the classic stuff. And also, wasn't there something about, I don't know if this was during Sign or Grudge or Blue Book, but there was something about how they were concerned that some enemy of the United States may use UFO sightings to crowd communication lines.
That came later.
Okay.
That was the Robertson panel.
Okay, that's right, Robertson.
Yeah, that was a CIA panel.
Yeah.
Some pretty interesting backstory to that as well that's not very well known.
Okay, cool.
But in response, this is where things get really interesting in terms of those two facets of even the intelligence community. How the factions were, I think they were kind of undertaking sort of a media war.
Yeah.
In January of 1950, True magazine contained a lengthy article written by Donald Kehoe, titled "The Flying Saucers Are Real," and in the article, Ruppelt states he took each sighting, detailed the facts, ripped the Air Force's official conclusions to shreds. He presented his own analysis, and this, combined with the fact that True had a name for printing the truth, hit the reading public like an 8-inch howitzer. Hours after it appeared in subscribers' mailboxes and on newsstands, radio and TV commentators and newspapers were giving it big play. UFOs were back in business to stay, and it's rumored among magazine publishers that Kehoe's article in True was one of the most widely read magazine articles in history.
Wow.
What's really important about that is that article introduced the concept of a government conspiracy. Before that,
Everyone
the
trusted
public
government.
generally had a lot of trust in the government, and the idea that the government might be lying to them or withholding information just didn't seem palatable to the public.
Yeah.
But Kehoe presented a lot of information that was convincing, and I think it illustrates the beginning of the back and forth between the two factions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember when we played the soundbite from in the Antarctica episode, right? We played the soundbite from Major John Sanford, and at the end of that, they also had a couple of comments from Kehoe, and he wrote the book called "Flying Saucers Are Real."
Yes.
Yeah. Yep, and I thought that Sanford gave a pretty good, that he was saying, hey, we have reports of incredible things from credible people, but Kehoe wasn't satisfied with that. You can tell by the way he's talking. He's like, well, despite what the Air Force is saying here, there have been lots of sightings by lots of credible people, and some of them by their own pilots, of these things burning past them at very high speeds. So yeah, there was a war going on there. And when we talked to Bosley, he said the same thing. He said that very interesting thing to us. He was like, listen, when you get in the intelligence community and you get kind of high up in there, you find out that everyone is interested in this stuff. They're all interested in it.
Yeah.
Well, as a result of that article, Project Grudge released a report that covered 237 investigations. They did this to try to, cool off interest and try to, portray that they had found solutions for all the cases.
Right. Yeah.
Well, when people started digging into information that the Grudge report contained, it had numbers like 32% were attributed to astronomical, sources, 12% were balloons, and 33% were categorized as either hoax, misidentified aircraft, or too nebulous to evaluate. However, that left 23% as unexplainable.
Shh. Don't tell him that. Leave that number out.
I knew 33 was going to be in there, dude.
33 did show up. Yep. Where's my bell?
I know.
One of the reports, one from November 18th, 1948, that was one of the unexplained ones. An Air Force pilot over Andrews Air Force Base observed an object. He approached it, and he turned on his landing lights to illuminate the object. And he described it on the radio as a dark gray oval-shaped object smaller than his T6. He says, I couldn't tell if it was the lights or if the object was glowing.
Wow. Yeah, they've been seeing these things for forever. And like, well, don't they show up over bases and shut things off and stuff? Aren't there reports of that too?
Yeah, there have been several reports. I actually have some of that in my notes.
That's
here,
later on.
Yeah, I do a lot of interviews for different topics, but this is the first time I've ever done any public speaking whatsoever on this topic. So if I sound like I'm tongue-tied, it's because I've got like a million thoughts in my head that I'm trying to somehow relay through my mouth.
Yeah.
It's not the easiest thing to do.
Zero mistakes.
Flawless the first time. Yeah, if you have a million thoughts, maybe we need to do 100 podcasts. Sounds like we need a lot of podcasts to get through all those thoughts. So, when did they change it to Blue Book, and what was the reason for that change?
Well, this is where things start getting pretty interesting also. In March of 1950, True Magazine did another article called How Scientists Tracked Flying Saucers. And this one was written by Commander R.B. McLaughlin, who was none other than the individual in charge of the Navy scientists working at White Sands Proving Ground.
Oh.
So he would be much more difficult to discredit.
Yeah. And it's the Navy now.
Right. And in the article, McLaughlin states, I am convinced that it was a flying saucer, and further that the discs are spaceships from another planet operated by animate intelligent beings.
You need to do that in your 1950s announcer voice, though. I am convinced that these flying saucers are inhabited by beings from other planets.
So, the next year, Grudge started attempting to downplay further the sightings as hoaxes, hallucinations, misidentifications, etc. And then a wire came from the Pentagon over to Grudge's office, and it said, let's see here. Mr. Bob Gina of Life magazine is leaving for Daytona. He wants to check some of the reports. Ruppelt said at the headquarters of Grudge, hysteria ensued.
Oh, yeah.
Upon Gina's arrival, the seasoned reporter grilled the Grudge officers which left them scrambling to save face. Gina was not easily drawn off the scent and came away unimpressed with the organizational skills of the individuals involved. In anticipation of what was surely going to happen, on September 12th, 1951, Ruppelt was offered the leadership role. So basically the people in charge bailed and dropped it on Ruppert's lap.
Okay. Yeah, so they had a real reporter show up who asked a bunch of hard questions, and then they had to change tack. Disband that whole group and start a new one.
So Bob Gina's article, which you read in episode
159.
159.
Yeah.
Right. That was the Life article.
It was right around 20 minutes in episode 159 if anybody wants to go back and hear it.
What's interesting about what Ruppelt says about that is really strange. He says the most important thing about the Life article was the question in everybody's minds. Why was it written? Life doesn't go off blasting off on flights of space fancy without good reason. Did the Air Force prompt Life to write the article? Was the question that many people were asking themselves. In answer to that question about the article being Air Force inspired, my weasel-worded answer was that we had furnished Life with some raw data on specific sightings. My answer was purposely weasel-worded because I knew the Air Force had unofficially inspired the Life article. The maybe they're interplanetary with the maybe bordering on they are was the personal opinion of several very highly ranked officers in the Pentagon. So high that their personal opinion was almost policy.
Wow. Man.
So here you have a very highly publicized article stating that UFOs are not only real, but they're interplanetary.
Yeah.
And the article was inspired by a general at the Pentagon.
Yeah. Who thought that, and because he thought that, it made it practically policy in the wow.
So interplanetary. So they're thinking like
They just mean basically not from here. That's how I take that. Because in the beginning they thought before we had a serious space program, they could have been from Venus or Mars or something. But
okay.
As we got better at looking at other planets in the solar system, it became clear that they're probably not from our solar system.
Okay.
But even in the contactee period, some of them seem to claim to be from planets in our solar system, and it wasn't until later on that they started claiming to be from farther off, right?
Well,
In the contactee period, they'll be like, "Oh yes, we're from Venus," or
Like they're just telling you whatever.
Yeah.
well, there's the whole Pleiades connection, that the UFO connection or the abduction connection of that came from, Betty and Barney Hill's.
Right, but that's much later, isn't it?
Right. But it was interesting in that the way that came about is Betty drew a star map that she
That's
was
right.
shown on the ship.
Yeah.
And they had no idea what that star map was. And then there was a researcher, think of her name, Marjorie.
Watch her.
Yeah.
Yeah, watch
Figure it
her.
out, Watcher.
She, trying to figure out what this map was, actually created a star map in her home. She placed a bunch of deals, and she would lie on the floor and take different angles looking at all these stars, trying to figure, or these, dots that would simulate the stars, to try to figure out what it was that Betty had seen.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that it matched the Pleiades.
Yeah, the Pleiades. Yeah. And I've seen other people talk about that, like that the star map must have been specifically made to show her, because you can't actually use a two-dimensional star map to fly around in three-dimensional space.
Yeah.
Right?
That goes back to that
The deception, yeah. Or that they've planned this encounter, and they're like, yes, we're going to show her this,
Okay.
However, their connections to the Pleiades going back to
Yes,
Egypt.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I just remember people pointing out, like, a little, like an actual piece of paper or a map with stars on it doesn't help you fly around in
Is
space.
this Martin Molnar Gulp?
Wayne Herschel?
No. It was a female. I think her name is Majori Fish, maybe? Something along those lines.
I do remember the
I have
story.
the worst memory for names.
Yeah, me too. But it just
It's
basically
cool,
what you were. Yeah, don't worry about it, Martin.
That's what the.
Whatever your name is.
Okay, Ross.
Yeah. Ross and Keith and Martin in the cube.
What you're suggesting is that part of the deception aspect of it is that during the period of time when we didn't really know a whole lot about the planets, that they could say, yeah, we're from this local planet.
Yeah.
And then after we got more and more data about the planets, then
They started claiming to be from
they
farther
start
out.
claiming to be. And that really suggests, projection on the part of the
It does. Yeah.
people who are witnessing this
Or a co-creation of some kind.
co-creation. You could take it that way, right? I mean, a scriptard extraordinaire like myself could basically say, yeah, so it's less credible, if you're trying to say something about
the people who were making up the accounts back then were making up that they were from Venus because maybe people could be from Venus, and then later they're like, no, now they're making it up that they're from Sirius or whatever.
Yeah, because it's just pushing the mystery further away.
Yeah.
Russ and I have had this conversation before. Yeah, I was right. We're pretty close, huh? Marjorie Fish.
Yeah, there you go.
Huh. Thank you.
Zeta
Marjorie Fish.
By the way, his microphone is slowly sinking.
Oh.
You ought to fix that. I've noticed that it's been drifting down very slowly this whole time.
All right.
There you go.
I'm trying to keep it kind of low. He's got to read a lot.
Yeah.
Well, so we've had this conversation, and I don't know. I kind of tend to lean towards the fact that the experiencers are fed information that is in line with whatever they're predisposed to believing.
Yeah.
That it's not necessarily factual. It's just they just feed off whatever inclinations that person might already have.
Yeah, so you could say that it's a effective method of communication between beings who are from vastly different
Experiences or something.
Yeah, so if you're trying to go communicate with, let's say there's some, butt flap tribe somewhere that has no idea about any technology, they have spears and butt flaps, and you're trying to communicate with them, you would try to do it in a way that was where they would recognize analogies, or you know what I'm saying?
Well, it just occurred to me that some of this could be interpretation. I mean, remember, odds are these communications are not taking place in English or whatever the native native language of this individual is. It's thoughts are being, I believe they say the thoughts are being projected into their minds, right?
Yeah.
So maybe this translator is using words that, we may be misinterpreting the words, it's just like...
so they're coming over here and they're using translate.
Right, exactly. You're using Google Translate and it's putting everything backwards and you're taking it word for word as gospel, and so that could be part of it, but there are instances where things that I find highly questionable. For example, a lot of these early contactees or abductees back, during the Cold War, let's say in the 60s or so, they were talking that these beings were concerned about nuclear war and that we were going to destroy the planet,
Yeah.
And then more recently, those concerns have turned to environmental concerns, that we're destroying the planet because we're, and who's to say that these projections, that they're not, let's just for the sake of argument, let's say they're shown a planet in shambles, right?
Yeah.
And the observer is trying to interpret these images that are being projected into their mind, and they make the connection that they must mean it's global warming, or something along those lines, when it may be a warning of some
Future
cataclysm, something
comet,
completely. And so it's not that they're trying to deceive the individual, it's that the individual is misinterpreting the information that's being relayed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is pure speculation. We have no idea, but it's a possibility.
Yeah.
So you can look at the cargo cults, if where these people think, well, if we build landing strips, that they'll come back, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine that throughout the time that, say, the Air Force was there communicating with these people, they're trying to figure out, well, how do you come down from the sky? And well, you got to have these landing strips, And so they think that that's what brings them. And it's, you know what I'm saying? It's, they have, it just gets lost in translation, basically.
Yeah. I saw a picture of one of the cargo cult planes.
Yeah.
The other day. It's all made out of grass and sticks, you know?
That's pretty cool.
It's really awesome. Yeah, all right, we got to take another break.
Oh, yeah, that's
Fastest
right.
2 hours in podcast. This is going by quick, yeah.